that I'm very, very grateful for the possibility of coming again to Montreal, to McGill, and especially to be once again together with my very good friends and I would say senior scholars. If we are the three Catholic tenors, I'm the minor tenor. They are the Pavarotti and Domingo, and Jose Carreras of the three. And I am very glad to see that Mr. Jonathan Burks, who I'm privileged to call my friend now, is also with us. Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, I remember the first class I attended at Innsbruck of theology. I understood one single word in the whole hour and 15 minutes. It was Mutter. Mutter probably was something about the mother of God, so probably, but this was the only word I understood in my first class in theology in Innsbruck. It took a while, but eventually I was able to learn the language. The lecture I'm presenting today is kind of a summary of issues, themes that I've been working in the last years. So I hope it's not too dense, but certainly it's very much appropriate for the Berg Forum's study of religion and globalization. So, world religions in the emerging global disorder. We are all familiar with the functioning of the two main dynamics of globalization, namely with the formation of a single world capitalist system encompassing the entire globe, and with the formation of an international system of territorial nation-states also encompassing the entire globe. In today's lecture, I would like to argue that there is a third dynamic which is as intrinsic to process of globalization as the other two, namely the formation of a plural and pluralist global system of religions. Perhaps the word system is too hard, it's not a system yet, but it's the process of globalization that has created this kind of thing that we can study. My lecture is going to proceed in two parts. First, I will present a brief comparative analysis of the three ongoing dynamics of globalization: the economic, the geopolitical, and the religious cultural. In the second part, following a brief analysis of the secularist assumptions built into theories of modernization within the social sciences and within the field of international relations, I will argue that the two main social functions of religion, which one finds in the foundational theories of Emil Durkheim on the one side and of Max Weber on the other, are still operative today in our emerging global order disorder, illustrating the power of the sacred in opposite alternative directions, either in the form of various kinds of religious nationalisms that can promote the sacralization of violence against the internal and external other, or in the form of doctrines and practices of universal fraternization that foster the culture of the encounter, bonds of solidarity, and conceptions of the common good that transcend all forms of national and social boundaries and borders, encompassing global humanity and a new planetary consciousness. So first, the formation of a global system of religions. The world capitalist system, as we know, is a single global economy with its own internal division of labor between capital and labor, between centers and peripheries, firms, markets, etc. It is a single, internally constituted and differentiated system intrinsically characterized by unequal exchanges. The world system of nation-states, by contrast, is a system of plural yet isomorphic units. It is constituted by the formation of a plurality of nation-states, all assuming a similar form, formally equal, yet grounded in the hierarchic and hegemonic world of superpower geopolitics. Both the world capitalist system and the world system of nation-states became globalized through the expansion of the European Westphalian system of territorial nation-states to the entire globe through Western colonialism and anti-Western, anti-colonial independence movements. The global world system of religions is not only plural, but pluralist. Each religion is and claims to be unique and different, yet equal to the others. It is therefore a system based on the principle of equal pluralist diversity. In this respect, the pluralist system is a radical departure from the old nomenclatura of true and false religions, which were themselves differentiated into schismatic, heretic, infidel, and pagan or idolatrous religions. The global pluralist system of religions is still being formed through a dual process of differentiation. First, through the mother differentiation of religion from non-religion, that is, from the secular, and B, through the differentiation of each and all religions from each other. Of course, the world religions are much older than the mother world system, but they all have been transformed by these global transformations in the same way that the old economies were transformed by the emergence of the world capitalist system, and the old polities were transformed by the emergence of the world system of nation-states. The still emerging global religious and secular dynamics are characterized by three interrelated principles. By the principle of religious freedom, a same inalienable individual human right, as postulated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations some 75 years ago, a bit more. By the principle of secular political systems which do not enforce or privilege any particular religious confession, and C, by the principle of mutual recognition of all religions, a dynamic which I've been calling global denominationalism. The principle of religious freedom as an individual human right implies that it is not creeds or doctrines that have rights, but rather persons have rights. In this respect, and this is what is radically new in the new secular condition, neither truth nor error have rights per se. The principle of personal individual rights entails a process of individuation and pluralization of spiritual searches and religious options within and without religious communities. In a certain sense, spiritual searches that for millennia have been reserved for religious virtuosi and elites are now accessible to ordinary men and women. But this also implies that in our secular age, belief and unbelief, religious faith and irreligious secularity become existential options for individuals and communities. The title of one of the major works of Joas, of the many works on religion that he has written lately, is Faith as Option. The principle of a secular political order implies not a secularist anti-religious state, not a laicist state, but one that aims to be neutral vis-à-vis all religions and ideologies. And thus such a secular state is necessary precisely in order to protect the religious, spiritual, and ideological options of all its citizens, and to protect and manage the existence of multi-religious and secular pluralism within its border, and most particularly to protect the rights of minorities, religious or secular. Processes of democratization have usually been accompanied by the expansion of such secular states throughout the world. But these are states that still maintain, there are states that still maintain a secularist anti-religious stand vis-à-vis all religions, or claim the right to distinguish between permissible and non-permissible religions. On the other extreme, there are states that in alliance with the national religious majorities, be it Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or what have you, develop forms of religious nationalism that discriminate against religious minorities. Finally, the principle of interreligious recognition follows from the acknowledgement of a fundamental sociological fact, of our social fact, of our global age, the recognition that global humanity is characterized by an irremediable religious and cultural plurality. This recognition in turn leads to the acknowledgement that religious pluralism, rather than being a negative fact that needs to be corrected and suppressed, is a positive principle that calls all religious communities to mutual respect and recognition, indeed, to interreligious dialogue. What characterizes the contemporary global moment is the fact that all forms of human religion, past and present, from the most primitive to the most postmodern, are available for individual and collective appropriation. Equally relevant, moreover, is the fact that increasingly they must learn to coexist side by side in today's global cities. And most of our cities are becoming global cities. Certainly Montreal today is a global city in terms of the origin of most of its inhabitants. While nationally religious dynamics are mainly conditioned by particular forms of secular regimes and by different patterns of state management of religious freedom and religious pluralism at the global level, we are clearly witnessing the emergence of what I call global denominationalism. It is the proliferation of deterritorialized, transnational imagined communities or global ummas, encompassing the great historical religions as well as many new forms of hybrid globalized religions. I mentioned a few, the Baha'is, the Munis, the Hare Krishnas, Afro-American religions, Falun Gong, etc., that I call the emerging global denominationalism. Of course, they compete with many other forms of secular imagined communities, and particularly, of course, with the most common form of secular imagined community, modern nationalism. The emerging global denominationalism in this respect includes religious as well as secular denomination. By denominationalism, I mean a system of mutual recognition of groups within society. It is the name we give to ourselves, I am so and so, and the names by which others recognize us. Indeed, distinctive of the American system of religious denominationalism, which first was born within the United States before it became a global process, is the fact that it is not state-regulated, that it is voluntary, and that it is a system of mutual recognition of group identities. The process of constitution of a global system of religions can best be understood as a process of global religious denominationalism at the level of global civil society, whereby all the so-called world religions are redefined and transformed in contraposition to the secular through interrelated reciprocal processes of particularistic differentiation, universalistic claims, and mutual recognition. Each world religion claims its universal right to be unique and different, thus its particularism, while at the same time presenting itself globally as a universal path for all of humanity. Global denominationalism is emerging as a self-regulated system of religious pluralism and mutual recognition of religious groups in global civil society. The sociologist Roland Robertson was the first to stress that processes of globalization are characterized by this dual interrelated dynamic of what he calls the universalization of the particular and the particularization of the universal. This interreligious dynamic is most clearly evident in the formation of a pluralist global system of religions and in the dynamics of interreligious recognition and dialogue. We in the West, particularly in Europe, have failed to comprehend this dynamic because we have been functioning under the assumption of theories of modernization and secularization that presuppose that religion is an old traditional phenomenon, characteristic of traditional societies, that is supposed to weaken with the advance of modern secular societies. Today, within the sciences of religion or within religious studies, however you want to call it, there is a new basic consensus that the differentiation of religion and the secular is a very modern phenomenon. That indeed the very generic concept of religion in the singular, with a plurality of forms, religions in the plural, only emerges in Europe slowly throughout the 17th century and only becomes globalized towards the end of the 19th century. It is towards the end of the 19th century that the new nomenclature of religious pluralism begins to emerge. All the isms that we know, all the isms only emerge from Catholicism to Protestantism to Judaism, to all the isms as isms. The names only emerge towards the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. Of course, much more Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, etc. So begins to emerge, replacing the old monotheist nomenclature of true and false religion. The first meeting of the World Parliament of Religions, organized during the 1892 Chicago World Fair, represents symbolically the emergence of such global denominationalism. With this, I come to the second part of my lecture, the power of the sacred in our global age, religions for holy war, or religions for peace and fraternization. Sociologically speaking, throughout human history, religions have served many functions, but clearly a dual social function or role. On the one hand, as stressed by Emil Durkheim, religions have been primarily a force of social integration, generating and regenerating common norms, values, and collective identities that serve to maintain both bands of internal group solidarity as well as attitudes of external animosity against the other. On the other side, as stressed by Max Weber, religions throughout history have also served, particularly in times of crisis and social transition, the prophetic and more creative function of stimulating process of fraternization beyond kinship group, tribe, or territorial society. Both functions could manifest a positive side of generating bands of solidarity and promoting wider fraternization, as well as the more negative side of sacralizing violence or the forced conversion of the other. Theories of secularization and modernity had assumed that both functions, while operative in the past, could no longer be performed in differentiated modern societies, making religion increasingly irrelevant to the functioning of the modern world. The active role of various religions in relevant political transformations that took place simultaneously in 1979 in places as diverse as Iran, the Islamic Revolution, Poland, the visit of the Pope and the emergence of solidarity, Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan Revolution linked to liberation theology in the United States, the emergence of the moral majority in the electoral process that led to the election of Ronald Reagan. Forced all these simultaneous manifestations, political transformations, forced a rethinking of the potential role of religions in the public sphere of modern societies, process that I term the deprivatization of religion. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, perpetrated by Muslim jihadists with immediate global repercussions, forced a rethinking of the potential role of religions in international geopolitics. Suddenly, governments, international organizations, social scientists, and journalists began to consider religion more seriously, though for mainly negative reasons, namely because of the power of the sacred in upsetting secular structures of global governance. The time has perhaps come to reconsider also the potentially positive role of transnational religious communities and institutions in rethinking and reforming global governance structures. Currently, one can observe both the negative role of certain religions in the configuration of national and international conflicts, as well as the positive role of others in the search for solutions to the many global challenges that are affecting contemporary societies at this time of transition to a new global disorder, still in a state of uncertain formation. In his address to the United States Congress on September 24, 2015, Pope Francis stated, quote, "Our world is increasingly a place of violent conflict, hatred, and brutal atrocities, committed even in the name of God and of religion. We know that no religion is immune from forms of individual delusion or ideological extremism. This means that we must be especially attentive to every kind of fundamentalism, whether religious or of any other kind." End of quote. I'm using the words of Pope Francis precisely to emphasize that no religion, none of the three Abrahamic sister religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and none of the three Christianities, Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, have proven immune to the sacralization of violence. Pope Francis uttered those prophetic words before the recent sacralization of violence by Moscow's Patriarch Kirill in the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, and before the renewed sacralization of violence by both parties in the Palestinian-Israeli war in Gaza. As a Spaniard, I am particularly conscious of the historical burden of Spanish Catholicism in this respect. One is to keep in mind the unholy violence perpetrated by the Spanish Holy Inquisition, established by the Catholic kings upon Christian heretics, as well as upon Jewish and Muslim subjects who had lived in Spain, in Al-Andalus, or in Sefar for centuries, and the eventual expulsion of both Jews and Muslims from Spain by the same Catholic kings in order to create a cleansed and homogeneous Catholic kingdom. This tragic expulsion in 1492 may be viewed as the initiation of the repeated patterns of ethno-religious cleansing that have accompanied the institutionalization of the Westphalian system of nation-states, first in Europe and then globally through colonial and post-colonial and post-imperial struggles. As a Catholic Spaniard, I also need to reflect upon the fact that the same year, 1492, also marked the beginning of the military imperial colonial conquest and the violent subjugation of the indigenous peoples of Spanish America and the Philippines that accompanied their Catholic evangelization. Additionally, one can mention the three civil wars of modern Spain, fought by one side in the name of God, Patria, and King, with the blessing of large sectors of the Catholic Church, as well as the long and violently repressive regime of National Catholicism under Franco, under which I grew up. While conscious that we should avoid judging the past from our present perspective and values, nonetheless, I wanted to remind ourselves of these repeated historical instances of sacralization of war and violence by Spanish Catholicism as a confirmation of the prophetic words of Pope Francis that no religion is immune. And of course, I'm talking of the Abrahamic religions, but the so-called pacifist religions or pluralist religions like Hinduism or Buddhism have equally proven not immune to the religious sacralization of violence. So in order to avoid precisely the impression that either Russian Orthodoxy or Islam or Judaism are particularly or uniquely prone to the sacralization of violence. Ultimately, the question concerning the relation between religion and violence hangs upon the condition under which religion serves to sacralize socio-political violence making it, quote, legitimate. Prior to the ethical prophetic breakthroughs, which we today associate with what has been taught in the Axial Age in various Eurasian civilizations, religion and the sacred were differentiated in all societies. Violence against the outsider or the scapegoat insider was often justified as sacred violence. The sociopolitical sacred can be defined precisely as that which has the power to sacralize political violence, turn it into a legitimate sacrifice pleasing to the gods or to the higher powers. During the Axial Age, for the first time in the history of humanity, communities of ascetic renouncers and prophetic denouncers put into question the sacred violence of sacred kings and socio-political rulers, calling for an end to animal or human sacrifice and announcing the coming of some transcendent sacred kingdom of peace and justice. Indeed, the end of sacrifice was one of the most important post-axial religious transformations at the beginning of our common era in societies throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East. But very soon, post-axial religions such as Buddhism and Christianity, which had been born as religions of peace, indeed as atheist religions that refused to participate in sacred imperial rituals and sacrifices, became implicated anew in the sacralization of imperial cults and socio-political establishments. Thereafter, it has been an open question throughout history if and when do religions serve to sacralize socio-political violence, and alternatively, when do they serve to challenge and to desacralize socio-political violence as illegitimate. Modern process of secularization, particularly the secularization of the modern territorial nation-state, once again have transformed the conditions for the legitimation of political violence. It is the modern state, the nation, and national citizenship which have become the publicly sacred in modern societies, with monopoly of the means of legitimate violence, while religion has often been relegated to the private sphere. The 20th century was probably the most violent and genocidal in the history of humanity, yet most of the extreme conflicts, World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Ukrainian Holodomor, the Stalinist purges in the Gulag, the Armenian genocide, the bloodlands of Eastern Europe, World War II, the Jewish Shoah, and the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the post-independence massacres in the Asian subcontinent, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Vietnam War, and the Khmer Rouge killing fields in Cambodia, the Balkan ethno-religious massacres, and the Rwandan genocide. And we could go on. This probably was written 15 years ago, but we could add civil wars going on in Africa today, or simply failed states and the violence that accompanies them. All of them were sacralized primarily by modern secular ideologies, even when the massacres may also have had a religious component. World War I was the apotheosis of the sacralization of the modern nation-state and of secular nationalist political theologies. All European Christian churches blessed the nationalist struggle, indicating the extent to which they had become national churches embracing modern nationalist ideologies. Millions of European youth were sacrificed in the trenches of the Western and Eastern fronts, and after the war, national monuments were erected in squares across Europe, honoring the sacred martyrs of the fatherland. Pope Benedict XV was one of the few dissonant voices lamenting what he calls the useless slaughter that was turning European civilization into what he called a charnel house. The sacralization of the ethnic group and the nation have remained constant throughout the wars of the 20th century until today. Communist and anarchist ideologies added the sacralization of revolutionary class violence, the sacralization of the Aryan race by the Nazi regime was the culmination of a long history of the colonial sacralization of violence, legitimating equally the white man's burden of civilized imperialism and black slavery, first throughout the Americas and then throughout the globe. A racial sacralization which still lives on today in the supremacist ideology of white Christian nationalism in the United States and elsewhere. While primarily promoted by modern secular ideologies, religious groups and religious traditions have frequently been also implicated in all these sacralizations of political violence. Yet throughout all these historical instances, one finds religious individuals and communities raising prophetic voices of critique of the unjust criminal violence, while serving as peacemakers and as potential agents of restorative justice, truth, and reconciliation. The names of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Bishop Desmond Tutu are as paradigmatic of contemporary global human prophecy as are the names of Old Testament prophets, Greek philosophers, Indian religious reformers, and Chinese sages, all of whom were contemporaries that we associate with the axial age. So we need to remain aware of the ambiguous, indeed ambivalent, hermeneutic traditions of sacralization and desacralization of socio-political violence which are to be found in the sacred text of practically all religious traditions, while on the other hand, we should be exploring the contemporary conditions under which different religious traditions are able to exit religious violence, promoting, pointing to ethical religious principles and practices which are also to be found in the same sacred text of all religious traditions and which may serve to desacralize all forms of human violence. Allow me to offer a brief excursus of the case illustration of the sacralization of the war in Ukraine. Today we are witnessing once again an extreme form of sacralization of violence through the fusion of sacred secular civil religion in the form of Russian imperial nationalism and the political ideology of the Ruski Mir, or the so-called Russian war, promoted by the Russian Orthodox Church, that serves to sacralize the war on Ukraine as a holy war. The Ruski Mir ideology serves a dual sacralization. It serves firstly to sacralize the ecclesiastical institution of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate as the sole canonical Christian church with monopoly jurisdiction over the entire world of Rus, which is supposed to comprise Great Russia, White Russia or Belarus, and Little Russia or Ukraine. According to this ecclesiastical ideology, the Christian faithful in Ukraine have no right to religious freedom, much less the right to establish their own Ukrainian churches, such as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is in communion with the Bishop of Rome, or the Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is in communion with the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. In addition, the Ruski Mir political theology serves to sacralize the war, in the words of Patriarch Kirill, as a quote, a metaphysical conflict between good and evil, between the culture and the civilization of Holy Russia, which is a defender of the true Orthodox traditional Christian values, and the decadent, secularist, liberal West and the European Union, which are trying to impose its gender ideology and its feminist values and gay rights agenda upon the entire globe and upon the Ruski Mir. The most basic and fundamental lesson that one needs to draw from the international war of aggression against Ukraine is that at its core, the ultimate cause of the aggression is a failure of recognition, namely the failure and the refusal of the Russian Federation and the Putin regime, but also of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate to recognize the Ukrainian people as Ukrainians, and that this is other, yet as equal, as historical subjects with the right to construct their own identity and to determine their own political destiny independent of Russia. The war in Ukraine is a paradigmatic example of the Hegelian struggle for recognition between master and serf. Two belligerents struggling to affirm their own subjectivity, but it is an unequal struggle that does not admit equivalence between the belligerents. The Ukrainians struggle for their own right to existence and for their dignity as free subjects. The Russians struggle for their historical right of domination over Ukraine and for their imperial honor as a superpower. That's why an interpretation of the war as a proxy war in which the Ukrainians are just victims of the struggle of imperial superpowers, NATO versus Russia over Ukraine, fails once again to recognize the Ukrainian people as free historical subjects fighting for their own freedom and condemn them to remain forever the serfs of alternative masters. It is also a blatant recognition or a blatant negation of the transition from the old paradigm of true and false religions to the new, still emerging paradigm of pluralist denominationalism based on mutual recognition and interreligious dialogue between diverse religious groups. And let me point out here that today Ukraine is the most religiously pluralistic society in all of Europe. It's not only you have a Jewish president and a Muslim minister of defense, but you have a council of churches and religious organizations representing every single religious community in Ukraine, which basically works together for the common good. They don't lobby the government for any particular privilege of one denomination against another, but usually they have to reach consensus as an association of religious organizations before they enter into discussion with Parliament or with the government on any public issue. The pretension of, and here I'm coming to the final part of my presentation, the pretension of embodying universality and universalism is a constant running through the various manifestations of European and Western culture through the ages. One could argue that such a universalist pretension has its origins in the intertwinement of dialogue and opposition between Athens and Jerusalem, which has been a constant of Western history. After World War II, Karl Jaspers insisted already on the need to go beyond Athens and Jerusalem in order to embrace, or at least to recognize, the multiple and diverse universalisms equally manifested in the axial age in ancient China as well as in ancient India. As we are entering a genuine global age after Western hegemony, the need to recognize the multiplicity and thus the particularity of all universalisms becomes the more important. Both the global capitalist system and the global international system of states still manifest the traces of Western hegemony and its universalist claims. By contrast, I will argue, the global system of religions, which is emerging despite its parallel origins in the universalist claims of Christianity as the true religion, has advanced much further in overcoming this exclusive universalism and entering a genuine encounter with all other religions on the basis of the dual principle of the right of each religion to be unique and different, while maintaining a certain claim to universality which is no longer exclusivist or incompatible with the parallel claims of the other religions. The question I would like to ask or to raise today is whether our system of global governance may not need perhaps the strengthening of a global civil society based on the principles of equality and diversity of cultures, moralities, and religions, as manifested in the global denominationalism, which, as I pointed out in the first part of my lecture, is characteristic of the global system of religions being formed today. The function of such a global pluralist civil society would be not to supersede, but rather to complement the present system of global governance. It is the transnational and transcontinental character of so many religious communities and their aspirations to address global humanity that give religions their special role within global civil society and the potential to contribute to a globalization of fraternity. Sociologically, we know that this has been the main contribution of religion throughout history, namely to generate and regenerate structures of solidarity with any social order, but also to facilitate prophetically process of fraternization beyond kinship and beyond tribe, beyond cities, beyond kingdoms, and even beyond empires. Thus, the dual function of religion in ordinary times to serve the traditional function of social integration through legitimation of the established order, and in times of crisis and transition, again, times, they are interrelated. In all times, these functions are there always present. To serve the charismatic prophetic function of critique and of envisioning new, more just and solidaristic social orders. But the focus of our attention should be redirected to considering the potential role of transnational religious institutions and communities in helping rethink and reform our structures of social governance. Indeed, the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic made evident the dysfunctional character of our global system of governance and its inability to respond in a globally responsible and solidaristic manner to the global public health crisis. This comes on top of the inability to offer credible responses to the growing global environmental or ecological crisis, to the growing global challenge of immigration and refugees, and to the global challenge of increasing inequality between and within nations around the world, and now to the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Global challenges demand global responses which neither the world capitalist system nor the world system of nation states seem able to provide on their own. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis expressed this idea in stark prophetic terms, and I quote him, is paragraph number 7. For all of our hyperconnectivity we witnessed during the COVID crisis, a fragmentation that made it more difficult to resolve problems that affect us all. Anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we were already doing, or to refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality. I repeat, anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we were already doing, or to refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality. End of quote. The global era we are entering is not the end of history, as some philosophers of Western modernity have insisted, but requires the construction of new norms and new systems if we are to move from the globalization of reigning indifference to a globalization of fraternity, as advocated by Pope Francis and other religious and secular leaders. The global capitalist system and the international system of states are the two dominant institutional structures which have demonstrated that they can only contribute really functionally to a globalization of indifference. Again, using the prophetic language of Pope Francis, the economy kills. But this is so not in the sense of the traditional Marxist critique of capitalism, because it is a system that is supposedly based on the universal exploitation of the proletariat for self-reproduction. It kills because the contemporary global economic system can do without large masses of the population in the outer peripheries of the south and in the inner peripheries of the north, since it no longer needs them as a reserve of labor power to reproduce the system. Large masses of humanity can be discarded as unskilled labor force, having to survive in the precarious subsistence of informal economies. According to the jargon of the Davos consensus, all these people cannot become, quote, stakeholders in the system. Capitalism today reigns supreme as the system capable of efficiently producing enough wealth to cover the basic needs of all of humanity, but the system continues to demonstrate its inability to redistribute this wealth equitably. Today, in the midst of the constant expansion of wealth and growing equality within and between nations, advanced democratic societies seem no longer able to find political consensus not only to redistribute wealth more equitably, but also to recognize in solidarity the value and dignity of all those who feel abandoned by both the economic and the political systems. Lately, Pope Francis has made an effort to promote with speeches and actions what he calls the culture of encounter, which is absolutely necessary in order to overcome the growing polarization, political, ideological, moral, and cultural that is permeating all our democratic societies. The promotion of the culture of encounter at all levels, interpersonal, between communities, cultures, peoples, societies, and civilizations, is one of the most urgent ethical normative tasks of our global era. As always, it is the weakest and the poorest who suffer the most serious consequences of all contemporary global crises. Thus, the preferential option for the poor is not simply a biblical ethical requirement, but is the only appropriate response both from a Christian perspective, but also from a realistic position of moral universal humanism. Only through the mobilization of the normative resources of social justice, peace, human fraternal solidarity, and integral ecology already existent in the global transnational civil society, still in formation and in need of greater institutional structuring, can there be hope that a new model of global integral development can emerge from the present crisis. Such a model will first have to emerge from below, from the base of the practice of transnational networks and movements before they find broader social institutionalization. It is here that global religious traditional institutions, which in fact already have a transnational structure, can serve to promote a globalization of fraternity. And I am coming to the last paragraph. Despite the dysfunctional character of many of the existing religious institutions, which is manifested above all in the still ongoing scandals of sexual abuse and in the still dominant clericalism and patriarchy, religions will have to be taken more seriously even when they prove capable of contributing in some way to the culture of encounter and to strengthening the bonds of global human solidarity beyond all borders and of all social division. In the Durkheimian language, religions could once again serve as a sacramental symbol of sacred transcendence that has the power to bring people together in new bonds of solidarity and global fraternity. From a strictly secular sociological point of view, such bonds of solidarity are absolutely indispensable in order to be able to develop both individually and collectively the strength and courage to respond creatively and responsibly to all the present challenges we are confronting as humanity. This is an open question, whether religions, in dialogue and collaboration with non-religious groups, will be able to respond to such a common and urgent task. Thank you so much.